Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Grace Cathedral. Well, not really. I'm not really in the church, but here is a wonderful view of our beloved Grace Cathedral. I'm Bridget Maley, and I'm so happy you're joining me this afternoon. I'm a trustee at Grace and an architectural historian by training, and I'm really excited to share with you this afternoon the history of building Grace. We will think about this as the first in a series of lectures, one of three, where this particular afternoon, rainy afternoon in San Francisco, I'll focus on the building and its evolution. And then perhaps later in the spring of 2022, we'll focus a little bit, we'll have a second lecture, we'll focus more on the interior, the stained glass, the murals, the other art and treasures that are in the church. And then lastly, thinking forward to fall, next fall 2022, we'll focus on the cultural history of Grace and its place in San Francisco and its influences and how it has crafted and changed the city. So with that said, again, welcome, and I'm going to share my screen and hope this works. Okay, and with me today is Rebecca Nessel, and she will help us at the end as we will have time for questions. So while the chat is disabled right now, we will have Q&A. And so if you've got questions as we go along, feel free to post them in the Q&A that you should see at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get to those towards the end of the lecture. So here we go. The story of Grace Cathedral is intertwined with the diverse history, society, and culture of San Francisco. A place of quiet repose and religious contemplation, the cathedral's art and architecture are singular among American spiritual buildings. Unlike its stone counterparts, St. John the Divine in New York and the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., San Francisco's Grace Cathedral is a reinforced concrete structure. The material selection was a direct consequence of the cathedral's rise from the devastation of the 1906 earthquake and fire that leveled San Francisco. Constructed over a period of 50 years and evolving still, Grace Cathedral is a compendium of religious iconography, historical events, personal influences, and community stories. It contains a collection of ornate stained glass windows, has precious works of medieval and religious art, is adorned with a set of replica doors modeled from a Florentine masterpiece, houses murals by Polish artist John Heinrich de Rosen, who departed Warsaw just before the Nazi invasion, and hosts a version of American pop artist and AIDS activist Keith Haring's sole work of religious theme, an altarpiece depicting the life of Christ. Among other things, Grace Cathedral has been captured in black and white by the iconic American photographer Ansel Adams, and has echoed with the passionate words of civil rights martyr Martin Luther King Jr., whose Grace sermon bellowed, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." It has swayed to Duke Ellington's jazz, absorbed the wise words of anti-apartheid leader Bishop Desmond Tutu, and been graced with innumerable international dignitaries, such as Princess Anne, sister of the enduring Queen Elizabeth. Most importantly, it has provided comfort to thousands of San Franciscans and tourists alike in times of crisis, whether that was to pray for the hundreds of thousands of troops who passed through San Francisco's port of embarkation during World War II, or to grieve for lost loved ones during the AIDS crisis. Grace was a gathering place as San Francisco tried to understand the horrible events of September 11th, 2001, and more recently, it was our comfort after the death of George Floyd and subsequent moments of reckoning. Grace is always ready for your moment of solace or to inspire you with its temporary art installations. From its earliest days, Grace played just as an important role in San Francisco's cultural history as its religious history. The story of Grace begins with a small gold rush era chapel a year before the country's newspapers headlines screamed gold found in California. A group of San Francisco Episcopalians petitioned the Board of Missions for a clergyman. The Reverend Jean-Léonard Vermeer was duly appointed. Holding a degree from the University of Leiden and with further studies under Bishop Doane of New Jersey, Vermeer embarked to San Francisco aboard the ship, the George Washington. He arrived in 1849 to find Trinity Episcopal Church already functioning. Understanding that San Francisco's ballooning population of 25,000 people could easily support 2 Episcopal congregations, and with the friendship of Trinity's Reverend Flavel Mines, Vermeer organized a second Episcopal house. Here you see an image of Grace Chapel depicted on a mural in the current Grace Cathedral. In his colorful autobiography entitled A Checkered Life, Vermeer recalled, "For 2 months, the Church of the Holy Trinity had been organized. Was there room for 2 churches? What was the missionary to do? I made a more personal acquaintance with Mr. Mines and on the following Sunday assisted him with the service. From that day, Flavel Mines and me, it was a brother to me. Together we worked, together we suffered tribulation. During the 3 years that he remained among us on the 8th of August, 1852, I assisted at his burial." Oops, sorry. Vermeer's own obituary several years later in 1886 described Grace Chapel, noting it was open for divine service on December 30th, 1849. Here we see a list of the places of worship from the 1850 City Directory, San Francisco City Directory, with both Trinity Church and Grace Chapel identified, indicating they were in very close proximity to each other. Selecting the name Grace to accompany Trinity was a direct reference to the 2 major Episcopal churches in New York at the time. Vermeer's first iteration of Grace was a small wood chapel erected on Powell Street. Here on the right, you can see the simplicity of this little building, in which the opening service was attended by mostly gold miners, and the collection received was a scattering of gold dust. Vermeer later reminisced, "My friends and future parishioners were hard at work to build a chapel for our use. James Ward gave a lot at the corner of Jackson and Powell Streets, rent-free for a year. Lumber in those days was dear as well as labor, and it seems impossible now to realize that the building, 20 by 60 feet, clapboard with shingled roof and 7 windows, should have cost $8,000. Yet so it was. There was a chancel with 2 side partitions, one for the vestry, the other for the choir, no benches, but rough planks." 2 years later, in 1852, Grace Chapel became Grace Church, after funding allowed for a slightly larger building to be constructed immediately next door. Here you see a view of the new Grace Church, which featured a single tower with a rose window. So here you can see the tower and a rose window. Adjacent to its predecessor. So this was the building previous, but it had been converted to residential use by this point. Trinity had also constructed a second iteration of its building, moving a further distance to Pine Street between Powell and Kearny, as noted here on the city directory of that year. This 1862 panoramic view of San Francisco allows you to see the locations of the second Grace Church and its predecessor, as well as the first and second Trinity churches. Vermeer offered a description of the second Grace Church in his 1864 autobiography. Architects, there were none in those days, so being myself a, quote, constructive disposition, I drew a plan and offered it for inspection at the next vestry meeting. It was approved, and the church stands there yet on the corner of Powell and Jackson Streets, just as I designed it, except the spire, which was wanting. The lack of that spire shows that the funds were not sufficient. No, they were not. The whole building with the lot came to just $12,000. And here a close-up of that same 1862 view with the small Grace Church converted to a dwelling. So you can see this is the new Grace Church, and this is the first Grace Church. And then you can also see in this image a closer view of the second Trinity Church, the first Trinity Church and the second Trinity Church. And on this map, and on this map, the first Trinity Church had been converted to the Powell Street Methodist Episcopal Church at that time. In 1853, the Right Reverend William Ingram Kipp was appointed the first Episcopal missionary bishop of California. His journey to the state was not without incident. Reportedly, after steaming down the East Coast, he crossed the Isthmus of Panama on a burro and then survived a shipwreck off of San Diego, finally arriving in San Francisco in January of 1854. Indeed, the presence of the Episcopal Church in California was growing, and here you see the portrait of the young Reverend Kipp on the left and a depiction of the Reverend Kipp in one of the murals in the current nave of Grace Cathedral. By 1860, a third Grace Church was envisioned. Moving uphill to California and Stockton Streets, Grace sold its older building to a congregation of the African Methodist Church. This is an 1886 fire insurance map of San Francisco showing the original Grace buildings on Powell Street. So this was the first church. This is the second church that had been sold to the African Methodist Church. And sorry, I lost my place. And you can see that if you'll recall that earlier image that I showed you of the first Grace Church, there's a porch that was added when it was converted to residential use. This 1875 view of the city of San Francisco, published in the San Francisco Newsletter and Special Circular, gives a sense of the growing city. You can see Market Street and the Palace Hotel. So here you can follow Market Street out. And this was the Palace Hotel, which was one of the largest buildings in the city at the time. And if we zoom in, we can see the third Grace Church here. The third Grace Church here. And St. Mary's, its Catholic counterpart here. And this is California Street running up the hill. And then you can see Trinity Church over here. The third Grace Church was designed by a transplanted Englishman, architect William Patton, who had immigrated to California in the frenzy of the gold rush. This church was much more elaborate than the two earlier wood frame buildings. It was of a sturdy brick and granite construction and decorated with playful gargoyles. A September 1860 newspaper article indicated the design of the new Grace Church was underway, noting, "A colored drawing of the new Grace Church, now building at the corner of Stockton and California Streets by William Patton, architect. The height of the spire is to be 190 feet. If the church is as beautiful as a building as this represents, it will prove one of the most elegant public structures in the city." And this article was describing an exposition of drawings that had been posted or provided for the public to view. And unfortunately, this view that they're discussing in this newspaper article no longer exists. We don't have that drawing. The new church was situated adjacent to the Imperial Hotel, and an October 1860 newspaper article provided some details about its design, including the 1.5 million bricks ordered from a Sacramento brick manufacturer and the decorative pressed brick to be used at the front facade. Photographer Carlton Watkins, who, while most famous for his early photographs of Yosemite, also provides us with some of the few images we have of the interior of the Third Grace Church. The Daily Alta California reported on September 29, 1862, that, quote, "The new and elegant Grace Church was thrown open yesterday morning for the divine service, for the first time since its completion. The Right Reverend Bishop Kipp officiated. Note that there was a series of large stained glass windows in the building, a decorative and carved altarpiece. And in this picture down here at the lower right, we see the building decorated and draped for Easter service. Architect William Patton was also designed some of San Francisco's other important early religious structures, such as the Temple Emmanuel, which was completed just after Grace Church. And here you see an announcement for the temple in March 1864. The distinctive building stands out in Edward Muybridge's famous 1877 panorama of San Francisco. Indeed, another Patton design, the Universal Unitarian Church, is also visible here. So here is the synagogue with its two very distinctive towers, and back behind you can see his other San Francisco church of this period. Patton's dramatically titled obituary from the San Francisco Call in 1899 noted that he was a native of Sunderland, England, and that he had designed many of San Francisco's landmarks at that time, including the previously mentioned Star King or Universal Unitarian Church, which you see here in more detail. Sadly, many of these, almost all of his buildings were destroyed in the April 1906 earthquake and fire. So we have very few of his works left. Here we see two images of Patton's Third Grace Church. First, just after it was completed, looking up California Street, and here you see the church. And then this is the Catholic St. Mary's here on the other side of California Street. And you see the cable car going up the street. And here on the other side, we see what was a later tower added to Patton's earlier church. And then again, St. Mary's here, and then looking down California Street, this time towards the bay. And so we arrive at the part of the story that relates to the current Grace Cathedral. After the earthquake, with so much of the city in ruins, chaos ruled. Here, looking down California Street after the events of April 1906, we see what remained of Grace Church and its neighbor, St. Mary's. In the background, we see the ferry building and the remaining shells of several of San Francisco's early skyscrapers. So here, this was what remained of Grace, and this is St. Mary's, the ferry building, the bay, Angel Island, and the remnants of several of the early skyscrapers that were left after the fire. There are some truly haunting images of Grace in ruins, each of which gives us a better sense of the building's elaborate brickwork. The enlarged tower at the front on the downhill slope of California Street, and a rare side view here that shows how basically everything around it had burned. And several views of the interior of the church showing the brick and several of the where the stained glass, the arched windows where the stained glass had been. In pre-earthquake San Francisco, the apex of Nob Hill, which became home to the current Grace Cathedral, was occupied by some of San Francisco's most fashionable, exuberant, and costly residential properties. Here, the 1886 Sanborn map with notable names such as Stanford, Hopkins, Colton, and Floyd. This is the California Street Hill, which then levels out and forms the top of Nob Hill. And here you see, so this is coming up California Street. This is the flat part, and then we'll keep going. We've got Taylor Street here, Mason Street here, Taylor Street here. Here you see two views of the Mark Hopkins and Leland Stanford houses, on the left from California Street and on the right from Pine Street below. Both of these houses dated to the mid-1870s. The Stanford Flood Mansion and the David Colton home and the Charles Crocker residence here you see in sequence across the flat part of California Street. So, oops, oh gosh, sorry. Maybe I shouldn't use the pointer anymore. This is the Flood Mansion. This is the Colton Mansion, and this would be the Crocker Mansion. And here, further down, another view of the more exuberant Crocker Mansion, and then the William Crocker residence beside it. So these two houses, the larger and more famous edifice was owned by Charles Crocker, a dripping Victorian built in 1876, and his third son and philanthropist, William H. Crocker, built a later Queen Anne style house immediately adjacent. And here you see the footprint of these two houses on a 1905 Sanborn map. This map provides historians with a remarkable snapshot of San Francisco just 1 year before the earthquake. The devastation of the earthquake was immense. Here, like these two solitary individuals, we are gazing at the shell of the Flood Mansion and the Fairmont Hotel and other buildings that had graced Nob Hill. Flood would rebuild, but the Crocker family decided on another course of action, and a dramatic gift by the family secured a new location for a much desired Grace Cathedral. Here you see several maps showing the earlier October 1906 block book with the Crocker names marked on the map, and then here by 1910 Grace Cathedral. And an announcement in 1907. So this gift was not an exact gift, but for $10 for each of the lots, they were awarded a site for their new cathedral. A lengthy article in September 1906 outlined a preliminary plan for how to implement a new building on the gifted site. And after much debate, and you can sort of read through this article, the initial plan was to try to salvage the old Grace Church, but after an inspection and in more detail, they realized that this really was not a valid or even logical approach to a new church. So with the gift of the Crocker family, the congregation began, or the diocese began to think about a much larger and grander building that would be a true cathedral. However, their first steps involved a temporary structure, which we have a brief description of in March 1907. The temporary Grace Cathedral on Sacramento Street near Mason, which actually this is Taylor Street, not Mason, is so far advanced in the construction that the contractors announced that it will be ready for opening on Easter Sunday. And this little view of the building is probably a little bit later. This is not March 1907, but you can see the remnants of what was the portion of the Crocker fence that went around the house, the Crocker property. Sorry. The following month, in April 1907, it was announced that George F. Bodley had been selected by the Grace Cathedral Corporation as architect of the new cathedral and other buildings to be erected on the site donated for that purpose on Knob, K-N-O-B, I love that, Hill in San Francisco by the Crocker family. Louis P. Hobart of San Francisco will be the architect's local assistant. George F. Bodley has a worldwide reputation. Fellow craftsmen consider him England's greatest authority on Gothic architecture. Not long ago, he was chosen architect for the cathedral in Washington, D.C. A resurrected Grace, however, was slow to materialize. Bodley, a few of whose English churches I show you here, died suddenly a few months later in October 1907. As a result, a senior architect from Bodley's office, Cecil Hare, was appointed, with the local San Francisco architect remaining Louis Hobart. This is Hare's very Gothic-inspired Nottingham War Memorial of 1922, which certainly conveys the architect's aptitude with the Gothic style. So we come to how local architect Louis Parsons Hobart came to this important commission. Hobart studied under Bernard Maybeck at the University of California, Berkeley, and then traveled to Italy to attend the American Academy in Rome, and then which was housed at that point in the Villa Aura, not far from the Vatican. And then from Rome, he traveled to Paris, enrolling at the École des Beaux-Arts. The École was the most important hub of architectural expertise in the world at the time. Hobart arrived in Paris having been recommended by Maybeck, who himself had studied at the École a generation earlier. Here you see a gang of architects dressed for an annual costume party and the types of drawings and renderings that Hobart would have undertaken in his coursework. Of course, Hobart would have also explored Paris, almost certainly visiting Notre Dame, perhaps multiple times. While I have not found a drawing of Notre Dame by Hobart, this is one by a student from several years earlier, Warren Perry, a fellow San Franciscan. It was in Paris that Hobart not only advanced his skills as an architect, but where he likely met his wife, artist Mabel Reed Deming. Her work in Paris was given a shout out in the San Francisco Call in May 1900, with Deming's drawing detailed in the article as hanging in a prominent position in the salon. During this period, both Hobart and Deming would have been exposed to the whirlwind of the Paris Exposition of 1900, a World's Fair that included venues along the Seine and emulating from the Eiffel Tower, which had been built for an earlier 1889 exposition. Paris at this time was a melting pot of culture and people, with some 50 million attendees to the fair of that year. All of this would have influenced and impacted young architect Hobart and his soon-to-be wife, Mabel Deming, who just happened to be the niece of Mrs. Charles Crocker. Upon their return to California, the Episcopal Bishop of Sacramento performed their wedding vows. Mabel was a talented artist who reportedly studied with James Whistler before his death in 1903. Throughout his career, Louis Hobart designed many fine homes in San Francisco and on the San Francisco Peninsula, including one for the Crocker family, which would later become the Burlingame Country Club. He was also responsible for many San Francisco homes, like this one you see on Pacific Avenue, which belonged to major donors of Grace Cathedral. But remarkably, Hobart does not appear to have designed another church during his career. As Hobart was beginning his career in San Francisco, his involvement in Grace Cathedral moved along at a slow pace. You can see that the plans from the British architect Hare did not arrive until the summer of 1909, and Hobart found he needed to make changes to accommodate the conditions that Hare could not have known about. A cornerstone was finally laid in 1910, and by May 1911, the preliminary plans and elevations were published in local newspapers. Here you see an early drawing by Hobart that would be refined over the ensuing years. And he did have a plan for the entire block, which did not transpire as he sort of thought through at the beginning, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. The nave, basement, and founder's crypt was a temporary home for the cathedral from 1914 to 1930. Here you see what that would have looked like with the shape of the long future nave and even the remnants of the fencing of the old Crocker mansion still surrounding the block. So you can see in this image that this was the long portion of the nave that would get sort of built above this superstructure that sat on portions of the block. In January 1914, the San Francisco Chronicle announced the consecration of the crypt and provided images of the fanfare of the day. So this was a big event in the city's history. Here's an image of the crypt, of that crypt level, and you can see, if I can go back. So these clear story windows that you can see along this temporary structure are these windows that you can kind of see along either side. And this is probably this is a later image. This isn't exactly 1914, 1915, but it gives you a sense of what the space was like. Sorry. Hobart also designed the 4-story cathedral house, which was completed in 1912, but later demolished in 1994, so that the great steps that now face Taylor Street could be constructed. This building also housed the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, which later moved to a site in Berkeley, not far from the university campus, which is now home to a number of seminaries and affectionately called God Hill. You'll see the French influence in this building that housed the Divinity School. And I show you at the bottom left here an apartment house in Paris that certainly would have been similar to maybe the housing that Hobart had when he was there in 1900. And then this on the right, the divinity school that he would later build on the cathedral close. Having completed the school on the site in 1912, it was not until 1927 that the cathedral project finally picked up speed again. Hobart's association with the Englishman Ware had ended, and he was fully in charge. However, he did bring in consulting architects Cram and Ferguson. Cram and Ferguson had been hired to complete or attempt to complete St. John the Divine in New York, and they had also designed the elegant Princeton Chapel and were certainly viewed as the best American architects working in the Gothic tradition. But it was Hobart who pushed the design forward in what we can only define as a rethinking of Paris's Notre Dame. His embrace of the French Gothic was likely further nudged forward by Mrs. Crocker's infatuation with French art and architecture. Recall that the Crockers had given the land and were among the cathedral's major benefactors. The first element of the building above the crypt to be completed was the Chapel of Grace. With its rounded apse, with its rounded shape, intimate feeling, slender Gothic arches, and decorative stained glass, it's clear that Hobart was inspired by Paris's Sainte-Chapelle, which was a tiny 13th century chapel built a stone's throw from Notre Dame. While not as heavily articulated as the exterior and far from the chapel's jewel-like rich in color interior, the influence is unmistakable. And here you see two views: on the left, Sainte-Chapelle, and on the right, the Chapel of Grace. Easter 1929, the San Francisco Press reported the following with the accompanying picture you see here. Immediately following the Easter service in the crypt of Grace Cathedral, a special service of Thanksgiving for recent progress in construction of the cathedral was held in the Chapel of Grace. The first unit to be erected in the program for the completion of what will be the greatest cathedral in the West. Work progressed, and by 1934, about 2/3 of the cathedral was opened for use. And you can see here, I love this image because you see the cement truck, and then all of this amazing concrete structure, which forms a portion of the nave, in which they had to, as the nave progressed, they always had to have an end wall. I just think this tells such a great story about how this building evolved. And speaking of which, here is a plan that we can sort of trace how the building progressed. So this is the Chapel of Grace with its rounded apse here in the corner. That building that was the crypt would have sat sort of, underneath all of this. And then the first portion of the church that was completed was the apse, the choir, and the crossing. Let's see. The North Tower, seen here under construction with its donor, Dr. Coulson, sitting in Huntington Park. He was a character. This is his romantically titled biography, The Bells Shall Ring, an account of the chime bells of Grace Cathedral, San Francisco, and how the boyhood dreams of Dr. Nathaniel T. Coulson at last came true. Was published in 1940 by Rosalie Baldwin. And here you see the good doctor in front of the North Tower. In his biography, in this book, the biography by Miss Baldwin, it's noted, the donation of the North Tower, the singing tower, and its carillon bells will keep his memory fresh for generations of Californians. Dr. Coulson was a dentist and a Brit by birth, and he survived the 1906 earthquake and viewed the cathedral, I think, as a symbol of the city's recovery. The North Tower was built out between 1936 and 1943, but another interruption, World War II, brought all work to a halt, and the final section of the cathedral was delayed. Construction did not begin again until 1960, but at that point, Hobart had died in 1954 and was no longer involved. And so you see here the Chapel of Grace, the apse of the cathedral, the crossing, a bit of the spire that would come later, central portion of the church, and then this gaping hole, and then the North Tower. And you can also just get a peek of this little building down here, which was the Wayside Chapel, or the Wayside Shrine of St. Francis. And if I go back one more, go down one more. So this little building sat on the site. It sat amongst all of the construction materials and the construction workers, and was really this little gem in a piece of chaos in the middle of the city as the building was being constructed. And people could visit and sit inside the Wayside Chapel and listen to the construction. Let's see. So the North Tower is completed. This is the Caroline Tower. And then the architectural firm, after Hobart's death, the architectural firm of Wahi Frick and Krauss was hired to complete, to oversee the completion of the cathedral. And this firm was the successor firm to the well-known San Francisco architect, Arthur Brown Jr. And so they oversaw the last portion of the cathedral's completion. Let's see, there's the Wayside Chapel again. So here is a view with the, looking from Huntington Park, with the two towers complete, the great rose window, the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, which was also called Gibbs Hall, sitting in front of the facade. And so how it's interesting how how the placement of the building on the site came to be was under great debate for a portion of the evolution of the site. The original drawings by Bodley had placed the primary entrance of the cathedral facing California Street, so that if you came down California Street, as you were approaching Jones, you would have seen the great entry to the cathedral. But at some point it was determined that the entrance should face Taylor Street, probably for a whole myriad of reasons. But I do think it's interesting because that happened, I think, after the building of Gibbs Hall or the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. So it kind of was in the way at one point. One of the more dramatic moments in the final years of construction of this great cathedral was the placement of the cathedral's spire. And here you see, I love this picture. You see this, you see the frame of the spire and this worker here, or this, maybe it's even one of the foremen up on top of this girder. And clearly this is before there were any such requirements for any sort of safety protocols on construction sites. And then here again, placing the spire onto the top of the drum that had been constructed many years earlier. And here's this worker again up on top, and we see the blessing of the spire. So this was really a very important event in the cathedral's history, and was covered in newsreels across the world. One of the last buildings on the Cathedral Close is the Cathedral School for Boys, which was built in 1966. And one of the murals in the church tells the story of the founding of Cathedral School for Boys. And there had been on that portion of the site a tennis court, and so Dean Bartlett was very much torn, I think, between the benefit of the Cathedral School for Boys and the loss of his beloved tennis court. And the cathedral choir of men and boys remains an important tradition at Grace Cathedral today, with boys from the school participating in the choir. And here you see that overall plan by Hobart that I mentioned originally. He had indeed envisioned a much larger, so this was the building that would be the school, that would be the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, but he envisioned that kind of continuing across with a library, with the chapter house, with a cloister, and then going further out and into more areas for the clergy, and a designed courtyard adjacent to the cathedral. And he even has this sort of baptistry here. So the site did not evolve as Hobart planned originally, but his thought process is clear in his idea that the Chapel of Grace would be built first, then the apse and the crossing. And he knew that because the building was of concrete construction, that it could be constructed in various phases, and that would not necessarily impact the ability for change to be made at a later date, which certainly happened. So Grace is still incomplete. Maybe not so much in a physical way, but in a spiritual and community sense, it is an evolving place. Today, the Grace community is reimagining church with courage, joy, and wonder. It is always embracing the history and tradition of the Episcopal Church in San Francisco, but shaping an inclusive and diverse future. Grace welcomes all San Franciscans and visitors alike to our incredible building and our community. And I look forward to sharing more about the history of Grace in this series of lectures. The next, in the spring of 2022, will focus on the art, the architecture, the murals, and all of the treasures inside the church. And then in the fall of 2022, we'll tackle all of the incredible influences that Grace and its deans and its community has had on the history and culture of San Francisco. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Maybe what we should do is I can stop sharing my screen and we can go to the Q&A. So let me figure out how to do that. Great. Well, welcome back into Grace. Let's see. Rebecca's going to help me with the Q&A. Let's see. I think. Sorry, I'm going to try to figure this out. Okay. Oh, I see. So first question, how many years of planning by Canon Forbes to find suitable space within the cathedral for his Cathedral School for Boys? Oh my gosh. Well, so yes, the building dates to 1966, the original portion of the building, but yes, it had been in plan earlier. And I do believe that the boys were in portions of the cathedral using portions of the old of the Gibbs Hall, which was the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. But I'm not exactly sure of the whole chronology of when was finally decided to do away with the tennis court and build the Cathedral School for Boys. I'm sure there was much discussion. Let's see. And there are great photos that show you could the courtyard that we know now, where adjacent to the church and in between the chapter house and the diocesan house, that was a parking area. And the diocesan house was built also was built in the 30s and sits at the corner of Taylor and Sacramento. And so the old fourth Grace, that little building that I showed you that was at the interim church, sat at the corner of, well, first it sat sort of mid-block, sort of along Taylor, and then when the Church Divinity School was complete, it was shifted a little bit, and then it was basically not used for any church services, and then the diocesan house was built. In that location. Let's see. So question, do we know why Bodley was hired? Did the Crockers or others in San Francisco have connections to him or the National Cathedral? You know, my guess is he was the primary sort of Gothic revival, Gothic-inspired British architect, and working with the Church of England, and with his background and with his work, I would assume that he was just one of the top candidates. I don't know. I don't believe, given the short turnaround time, that there was any kind of solicitation or competition that went on. But I'm not sure about that. I know that he had connections to Washington Cathedral, and it's very possible that at that time there was just such closeness amongst the Episcopal community that it was just sort of assumed that he would go from that project to this project, and there would be no questions asked. But his subsequent death sort of threw everything into a mire of what to do. Let's see. Okay, when were the famous doors fabricated? So I'll just quickly mention that I'm going to cover that in the next lecture, but since that's a couple months away, I'll give you a little tidbit. It was there was a worry during the war that those doors would be damaged, and so there was a mold taken, and then they were fabricated. And I believe there's one other, and I will know more about this by the time we have this lecture. There's one other set of the doors that were taken from that same mold. Let's see. Looking at, let's see, scrolling through these. Any discernible relationships between the Legion of Honor, Spreckles, and the Grace Church Crockers, both monuments with such incredible Parisian connections, but such different histories? I think the connection is this incredible number of architects that went from San Francisco really to the École at this period. There were a number of them, and they came back with a clear sense of the French style of architecture, and with classicism behind them. And I think that if you think about San Francisco's clean slate in 1906 of trying to just rebuild everything, at the time, the styles of architecture were very much looking back to classicism and the Gothic, and that was the primary influence that these architects were looking at. Let's see. Let's see, a question. Would love to know more about the decisions which lay behind the reconfigurations of the interior. In old photos, it appears that there were more pews before the new altar was added in the 60s. This may be covered in a future forum. That is a good question. I assume that perhaps maybe what happened is, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back up so I can see the question again. That's okay. My guess is, yeah, that at some point, thinking about how seating would work in the building, And also over time, as the building progressed across down the block, my guess is that maybe at each one of those iterations, when it opened the next phase, that there would have been maybe some reconfiguring of the interior seating, but I will keep that in mind for the next lecture, which will be much more focused on the interior of the building than this. So question, was the decision by the Crockers to relocate linked to further rethinking of the area on the top of Nob Hill? I would say there wasn't necessarily a full thought out process of rebuilding Nob Hill, but the Crocker properties, given a series of deaths and decisions to build houses on the peninsula and also a house further over in Pacific Heights, that my guess is they just decided that it was okay to give up this location. I will say that very quickly after the earthquake, the area of Lower Nob Hill, so the area, the slope that goes down towards Union Square, which had been, somewhat very residential in character and low scale residential, became much more high occupancy residential. There were just all these apartment buildings that were cropping up, and it became much more multifamily. So my guess is perhaps, it became less fashionable to have a Nob Hill home. I mean, the earthquake also changed the whole character of Van Ness Avenue, which was very residential prior to the earthquake. So the burn area, which extended to Van Ness, then just kind of resulted in a lot of that, high-end single-family houses moving out into Nob Hill. I mean, into Pacific Heights. Gosh, let's see. All right, I'm going back down. When was the labyrinth added and by whom, and by whom was it designed? So the labyrinth, this will also be covered in the in the interior discussion. Well, there's two labyrinths. There's the interior labyrinth, and then there's the labyrinth that sits outside between sort of behind the diocesan house. And as I don't know the exact dates of either of those. I should, but I don't off the top of my head. I'm sorry. How about I follow up with that in the next lecture? Let's see. When was the Nativity Chapel built? So the Nativity Chapel sits at the crossing, sits behind, and so that came in the I guess maybe I should, well, shoot, I can't get that back. I was going to say I could show the evolutionary plan again, but that chapel came to, let me just look here. That's in the section of the building that would be, so the Chapel of Grace was first. That would be in the 30s. That would have been in the 30s. And then the decoration, the mural, that mural in the Chapel of the Nativity is also by DeRozan. And so that dates to the late 40s, early 50s, the chapel, but I mean, the mural, but the chapel was built, but maybe it remained undecorated. I'm not sure if along that back wall, there was a previous decorative component. That would be interesting to find out. So I'll look for that. Keep going here. I heard that one of the female Crockers refused to live in San Francisco after the earthquake and fire. Well, that could be, that very well could be. There was certainly a lot of worry and after the earthquake, many of the families that could afford it built quite grand houses on the peninsula. So you'll see, there's a whole history of that occurrence. But many of the families who had houses in the Nob Hill and extending out on Venice also built, as I said, in Presidio Heights and Pacific Heights, and did not rebuild on some of their on their previous owned land on Nob Hill. Really, it was only the Flood Mansion that got rebuilt. Let's see. Okay, somebody wants to know, at some point, can you cover the 1990s completion of the cathedral close? Yes, I can, and maybe I'll do that at the beginning of the next lecture. And so what happened in the early 90s was the removal of the Gibbs Hall, which was the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and the reconfiguration of the Great Stair. The diocesan house was retained, and then the and then the chapter house was constructed. And then also in the, I guess it was the late 90s, there was an addition to the Cathedral School for Boys as well. So all of that happened, and yes, it can be, I can discuss that more in the next lecture. Let's see. After donating the land and hiring Bodley, did the Crockers stay involved? Do you know which Crockers? Well, so, I mean, I don't know exactly which Crockers, but there's definitely involvement. And I would love to know more about how the relationship between Hobart, his wife, who was the niece of Mrs. Crocker, and how all of that transpired. So for instance, they marry in 1903, and the Demings were from Sacramento. And I assume that, so I'm forgetting her name. I think it was Anne Deming, was the wife of Charles Crocker. And I'm probably getting this mixed up, but and so would love to know more about her family, which seems to have ended up in Sacramento, and that relationship between, how that relationship evolved between Bodley kind of dying and the Cecil Hare taking over, and then figuring out, did Hobart really exert himself, sort of say, I'm taking this over, I'm going to do this, and which of the Crockers stayed involved over time. So yes, and I think that will show up more on some of these interior, some of the interior donations, some of the stained glass, and the involvement of the family as the building progressed. Yes, we'll trace that. Let's see, gosh. So questions about some of this, so are the wonderful stained glass windows installed all at once, or kind of over time? And I think we'll cover that in the next lecture, of course, but yes, they were installed over time. Several different studios were involved. And then even more recently, there were windows that were installed. So we'll cover that in the next lecture. And since we are at 4:59, maybe that is the time to sort of sign off from Grace. And all these are amazing questions, and I'm going to make sure that through Rebecca, I can go back and look at these and make sure I get them covered for our next discussion. And actually, one last thing I should say is that as we move into the interior of the building, it'll be really interesting to sort of trace that progression, and to also see if as the building progressed from Jones Street toward Taylor Street down California, if there were changes that were made to the interior decorative scheme. So on that note, it has been so lovely on a rainy San Francisco day to join you from inside Grace Cathedral. I hope you all have stay dry, and to my East Coast friends that joined us, have a great evening. Thank you so much.